Welcome, my loyal subjects, to this grand court. Yes, I am listening to your wise counsel.
The twin brother who pretended to be the king for 10 years. For 10 years, I sat on my brother's throne, answered to his name, slept in his bed beside his wife, and not one person outside a small circle of terrified old men knew that the king of Obudoma had been dead, or missing, or worse, since the day he rode into the Ugu forest and never rode back out. Then, on the 10th anniversary of that battle, a man wearing my brother's face walked out of the tree line at dusk, followed by an army that cast no shadows, and I understood, in the space of one breath, that the real danger had never been the secret I was keeping. It was what my brother had become while I was busy keeping it. If you want to know how far a man will go to save a kingdom and what it costs him to wear another man's crown for a decade, stay with me, because this story does not end where you think it does. And if tales like this pull something loose in you, the kind that dig into the old forests of our history and refuse to let go, subscribe now so you are already here when the next one begins. My name is Chukwuemeka. Though for 10 years, almost no one in Obodoma called me that. They called me Ikemba, king of our people, son of the great warrior line that had ruled the land between the two rivers for 6 generations. But Ikemba was my brother, born only minutes before me, and I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. I did not steal his throne out of greed. I did not plot in the shadows to take what belonged to him. What happened to me, what happened to all of us, began with love and loyalty, and a decision made in the worst hour of my life, a decision I have carried like a stone in my chest every single day since. Ikemba and I were raised together in the palace at Obodoma, sons of King Eberechukwu, a man both feared and beloved, the kind of ruler whose name alone could quiet a rowdy market or steady a frightened army. Though we were twins, identical enough to fool our own mother in dim light, we were nothing alike beneath the skin. Ikemba was fire from the moment he could walk, quick to anger, quicker to laugh, a boy who climbed the tallest Iroko trees in the palace courtyard simply to prove he could, who challenged the palace guards to wrestling matches he had no business winning, and somehow won anyway through sheer stubborn will. He was born to lead, and everyone who met him seemed to sense it instantly, the way you sense heat before you touch a flame. I was the quiet one. I watched more than I spoke, learned the names of every elder and every trade dispute and every old law before I was old enough to understand why any of it mattered, simply because sitting still and listening was easier for me than commanding a room. Our father used to joke that between the two of us, he had somehow raised one king and one scribe. And though he meant it with affection, I felt the weight of that comparison more than I ever let him see. There is a memory I return to often from our boyhood, one that I did not understand the full weight of until many years later. We were perhaps 9 years old, and our father had taken us both to observe a council session for the first time, seating us on low stools at the edge of the chamber and telling us to watch and learn. Ikemba grew restless within moments, fidgeting, whispering questions I could not answer, eventually falling asleep against the wall before the session had even reached its second dispute. I sat perfectly still the entire afternoon, absorbing every argument, every counter-argument, every subtle shift in an elder's tone that signaled when a compromise was truly being reached versus when it was simply being tolerated. Afterward, walking back to our chambers, our father placed a hand on each of us and said, something I did not fully appreciate until I was much older. He told us, a kingdom needs its fire, but fire alone burns everything to ash eventually. It needs water too, patient and quiet, to keep that fire from consuming the very house it was meant to warm. I did not know, standing there as a boy of 9, that he had just described, without either of us realizing it, the exact roles fate would eventually force us both to play. When our father died, the succession was never in question. Ikemba was born first, by mere minutes, but our people held tightly to the old law, and the old law said the firstborn son sits the throne. I did not resent this. I want to be honest with you about that, because everything that follows will sound impossible to believe unless you understand that I loved my brother without complication, without the bitter envy such stories often imagine between men who share a face but not a birthright. I stood beside him at his coronation, watched the elders place our father's beaded crown upon his head, and felt nothing but pride and a quiet relief that the burden of ruling had not fallen to hands as uncertain as mine. Ikemba ruled well for a young king, bold in the ways our people needed boldness, and wise enough, more often than not, to listen when I counseled patience in matters that called for it. He married Amarachi, a chief's daughter from the river settlement, a woman with a gentleness that seemed to steady my brother's fire without ever dimming it, and for a handful of years, Obodoma knew a peace so complete that the old women in the market began telling children it was the golden season their grandmothers had always promised would return. I remember the day Ikemba first brought Amarachi to the palace, how the entire court seemed to lean forward as one body to study her, this quiet river chief's daughter who had somehow caught the eye of a king known more for his restlessness than his patience in matters of the heart. She was not the kind of beauty the market songs typically praised, not the sort that turned heads simply by walking past. Her beauty revealed itself slowly, in the steadiness of her gaze, in the way she listened to a person speaking as though nothing else in the world existed in that moment, a quality so rare among the palace's usual flatterers that I found myself, even then, drawn to her presence in ways I did not yet fully understand or examine too closely until years afterwards, staring at my own reflection wearing my brother's face and wondering in my most honest and shameful moments whether some tangled thread of that old noticing had made the eventual crossing of a boundary I should never have crossed feel at the time less like betrayal and more like an inevitability I had simply been too dutiful to acknowledge sooner. That season ended the season the raiders came down from the northern hills, a scattered, brutal confederation of war bands that our people simply called the Ochendo, the whirlwind, because they struck like weather rather than men, fast and merciless, and gone before a proper defense could be raised. They burned 2 border villages before Ikemba's army even reached the frontier, and by the time my brother led our warriors north to meet them, the Ochendo had retreated into the one place no sane army willingly followed an enemy, the vast, ancient stretch of woodland our people called Oke Ohia, the great dark forest, a place so old and so thick with shadow that even our bravest hunters avoided its deeper paths, and our elders spoke of it only in lowered voices, as though naming it too loudly might draw its attention. I begged Ikemba not to follow them in. I remember that conversation with a clarity that still makes my chest tighten. The 2 of us standing at the forest edge as our army waited behind us, torches guttering in a wind that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once.
The Ochendo wants you to chase them into that forest, I told him. No enemy retreats somewhere they fear more than the battlefield unless they know something we do not. Ikemba only laughed, that quick, bright laugh that had disarmed councils and enemies alike since we were boys, and clasped my shoulder the way he had 1,000 times before. Emeka, he said, using the shortened name only he ever called me. You worry enough for both of us. That has always been your gift and my burden. But a king who lets his enemies hide behind old superstition is a king who loses his kingdom one village at a time. I will not let that happen while I still draw breath. He rode into Oke Ohia at the head of 300 of our finest warriors that morning. 4 days later, 17 of them stumbled back out, half-starved, wild-eyed, speaking in broken, terrified fragments of shadows that moved without bodies attached to them, of trees that seemed to shift position when no one was watching, of losing their king somewhere in the deepest part of the forest during a battle none of them could clearly remember, a battle they described less like combat and more like drowning in darkness that had teeth. Ikemba did not come back with them. And for 10 years, until the night I am telling you about now, I believed, the way our whole kingdom believed, that the forest had simply taken him, the way it had taken so many foolish men before him, and that I would never see my brother's face again except in my own reflection. I need you to understand what happens to a kingdom the moment its king vanishes without an heir grown enough to rule. Because what happened next was not my idea, not truly, though I have spent 10 years wondering whether I should have refused it regardless. Obodoma sat between two ambitious neighbors, the river kingdom of Igbo to our east and the mountain clans to our west, both of whom had spent generations eyeing our fertile land between the two rivers with the patient hunger of predators, waiting for weakness. Ikemba had no children yet with Amarachi, no clear heir beyond myself, a twin brother the old law had never anticipated needing to rule. Within a single week of his disappearance, scouts brought word that Igbebuike's army had already begun massing along our eastern border, testing whether Obodoma's throne truly sat empty. It was Nuafo, our father's oldest and most trusted advisor, a man who had served 3 kings before Ikemba and had watched our kingdom bleed through every season of weakness he could remember, who first spoke the plan aloud, in a private council so small that only 4 of us ever knew the full truth of it. Myself, Nuafo, the palace priestess Chioma, and eventually, unavoidably, Amarachi herself. "You share his face," Nuafo said to me that night, his voice low and urgent in the flickering torchlight of the council chamber. "You share his blood, his bearing, enough of his manner that strangers have confused you your whole lives. If Ibebrike or the mountain clans learn that Obodoma's king is gone and no heir stands ready to rule, they will not wait politely for us to grieve. They will burn every village between here and the coast before the rainy season ends. But if the king appears to still sit his throne, if his people still see his face at council, at market, at the border, they will not dare test a kingdom they believe still has its lion." I refused at first. I want you to know that. I told them it was madness, that deceiving an entire kingdom, deceiving my own brother's wife, was a sin no crown could justify. But Chioma, the priestess, who had served the spirit of our land since I was born, said something to me that night that I have never been able to fully shake loose from my chest. "Your brother rode into that forest to protect his people," she said. "If you refuse this now, out of pride or fear or grief, you are not protecting his legacy. You are burying it, along with everyone else this kingdom will lose to war, while you insist on being honest about your own limitations." So, I became my brother. I learned to laugh the way he laughed, quick and bright and just slightly too loud. I learned to stand the way he stood, chest forward, hands loose at his sides, never crossed, because Ikemba believed crossed arms made a king look defensive rather than strong. I studied every mannerism I had watched my whole life without ever needing to memorize it, and within 2 months, even the palace guards who knew both of us since childhood stopped hesitating before addressing me by his name. Those first months were the hardest of my life up to that point. Harder even than the grief of believing my brother dead, because grief at least allowed itself to be felt honestly, while this new burden demanded I bury every honest feeling beneath a performance that could never once be allowed to slip. I practiced alone in my chamber late into the night, repeating phrases Ikemba favored, rehearsing the particular tilt of his head when he grew impatient during long council debates, forcing my own naturally quiet nature into a shape it had never been built to hold.
I sometimes stood before a polished bronze mirror our mother had once owned, staring at a face that was and was not my own, and felt something close to grief for the brother whose name I now wore like borrowed cloth, and something close to terror at how easily, how frighteningly easily, I found myself slipping into his rhythms. Until some mornings, I genuinely struggled to remember which parts of my performance were pretense and which had simply become, through sheer repetition, a version of myself I had not chosen but could no longer fully separate from my own. Noafo coached me through the mechanics of it with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that a single mistake, one wrong word in front of the wrong visiting dignitary, could unravel everything within a single afternoon. He drilled me on the names of every border chief, every trade agreement Ikemba had personally negotiated, every private joke my brother had shared with council members over the years that a stranger wearing his face might otherwise stumble over without warning. Chioma, for her part, handled matters of ritual and ceremony, teaching me the specific cadence Ikemba used during seasonal blessings, the particular way he held his hands during ancestor invocations, small details that would have meant nothing to an outsider, but our own people, watchful as any family long accustomed to a beloved leader's habits, would have noticed instantly had I gotten them wrong. The hardest part, the part I still cannot speak of without my throat tightening, was Amarachi. She knew the truth from the first night, of course. There was no world in which we could deceive a man's own wife about something so intimate, so she alone, beyond our small council, understood exactly what I was and was not to her. We agreed in that first terrible conversation that I would rule as Ikemba in every public matter, but that our private lives would remain separate, that I would sleep in the outer chamber rather than her bed, and that whatever affection had once existed between her and my brother would not be forced on me by circumstance, nor onto her by grief. I remember that first conversation with a clarity that has never faded. The two of us sitting across from each other in her private chamber, the candlelight throwing long shadows across a face still swollen from days of unbroken weeping. She studied me for a long while before speaking, searching my features for whatever fragments of her husband she could still find there, and whatever fragments of a stranger she now had to learn to live alongside. I do not know how to look at you, she admitted that night, her voice raw, and she wiped up her eyes, steadying herself with visible effort. But Noafo is right, and Chioma is right, and I understand, even through my grief, why this kingdom needs what you are about to become. I only ask you one thing of you, Chukwuemeka. Do not let me forget who you truly are beneath his name. Promise me that much, at least. I promised her that night, and for the first 3 years of my reign, I held carefully to that promise and to the boundaries we had agreed upon, treating her with the respectful distance owed to my brother's grieving widow, rather than any warmth that might blur the difficult line we had drawn between us. We held to that agreement for almost 3 years before it began, slowly and against both our wills, to crack. I will not pretend the years that followed were simple, or that guilt did not follow me into every council meeting, every festival, every quiet night I spent lying awake in a bed that was not mine, wearing a name that was not mine, ruling a kingdom that believed I was someone I could never fully become, no matter how well I learned to mimic him. But Obodoma survived those years, and more than survived, it thrived. Igbo scouts withdrew from our border within the first season, convinced their aggressive posturing had been noticed and rebuffed by a king still very much in command of his throne. The mountain clans, seeing Igbo retreat, decided against testing us themselves. Trade returned, harvests were good. I ruled with the same patience and careful listening that had always been my nature, and slowly, without ever intending it, I became a version of my brother that was somehow both entirely false and, in the ways that mattered most to our people, entirely real. There was a particular council session in the second year that I still remember vividly because it was the first time I understood with real clarity that I had begun to rule not as an imitation of Ikemba, but as something genuinely my own, hidden inside his borrowed name. A dispute had arisen between two border villages over grazing rights along a shared stream, the kind of small, bitter conflict that had, in years past, occasionally escalated into real violence between neighboring families. Ikemba, I knew from years of watching him, would likely have settled it quickly and decisively, favoring whichever village presented the more forceful argument, trusting his instinct for strength over prolonged deliberation. I did not trust my instinct that way. I spent 3 full days speaking privately with elders from both villages, walking the disputed stream myself at dawn to understand its actual flow before the dry season arrived, and ultimately proposed a rotating seasonal arrangement that satisfied neither village completely, but left both walking away without the resentment a decisive ruling in either direction would have planted. Nwafor told me afterward, in the privacy of the council chamber, that it was the kind of judgment our father himself might have rendered, and I did not know, hearing those words, whether to feel pride or a fresh wave of guilt, knowing that the compliment belonged to a man wearing another man's crown. It was in the 4th year that Amarachi and I finally stopped pretending the growing tenderness between us was simply grief seeking familiar comfort. I will spare you the particulars of how it happened, only that it happened slowly. Born not from deception, but from two people who had spent years standing very close to a fire neither of them had chosen to light, until one night the distance between us simply dissolved and neither of us had the will left to rebuild it. I loved her. I want to say that plainly, without shame, though shame followed the admission for years afterward regardless. I loved her, and some quiet, guilty part of me wondered in my weakest moments whether some part of her had come to love me too, not simply the ghost of my brother she saw whenever she looked at my face, but me, Chukwuemeka, the quiet twin who had always stood one careful step behind the throne. We never told anyone beyond our small circle. Chioma suspected, I believe, though she never spoke of it directly, only watched me sometimes with an expression I could not fully read, something between sorrow and understanding. Nwafor grew older and more frail as the years passed, carrying the secret's full weight visibly in the stoop of his shoulders, though he never once suggested we abandon the deception, understanding perhaps better than any of us exactly what abandoning it would cost the kingdom. And so, 10 years passed, season after season, harvest after harvest, until the deception had become so complete, so woven into the fabric of daily life in Obodoma, that some mornings I woke and genuinely forgot for the length of a single confused breath that the name people called through my chamber door was not truly mine. There were moments across those years, rare but unforgettable, when the weight of what I carried nearly broke through the surface entirely. I remember an evening in the 7th year when a traveling storyteller passed through Obodoma's market, performing an old tale about a man who wore a spirit's borrowed face for too long and slowly lost the ability to remember his own. I sat among the crowd that night, hidden beneath a simple cloak rather than my usual royal dress, and listened to that story with a dread that settled so deeply into my chest I could not sleep for 3 nights afterward, certain the old tale had somehow been sent specifically to warn me of a fate I had already set into motion. I remember, too, a quieter moment the following year when a young boy in the market, no older than 7, looked up at me during a public blessing and asked with the innocent bluntness only children possess why the king's laugh sometimes sounded different depending on the day. I answered him with some practiced deflection about the burdens of ruling weighing differently on different mornings, but I carried his question with me for weeks afterward, wondering how many others in Obodoma had noticed small inconsistencies over the years and simply chosen out of loyalty or fear or simple disbelief that such a deception could even be possible, not to speak them aloud. I should have known peace built on a lie this large could never last forever. I should have understood that a debt this heavy, hidden this deep, would eventually demand to be paid, the way every hidden debt in every story like mine always does. But I let myself believe, foolishly, that 10 years of careful rule had somehow earned Obodoma the right to keep its secret buried indefinitely. I was wrong, and the forest made sure I understood exactly how wrong on the very night of the 10th anniversary of the battle that had supposedly claimed my brother's life. We hold a remembrance each year on that date, a quiet ceremony at the edge of the forest where the priestess offers prayers for the warriors lost in Oke Ohia, where the families of the fallen gather to grieve openly in a way our customs rarely permit during ordinary days. I stood at the front of that gathering as I always did, wearing Ikemba's face and Ikemba's crown, watching Amarachi light the ceremonial fire meant to honor a husband she had, in every practical sense, quietly stopped mourning years before, though the public performance of grief never fully ended for either of us. The sun had nearly finished setting when the first murmur rippled through the crowd, a low, uneasy sound that spread faster than any words could travel. I turned toward the tree line, and my entire body went cold in a way I have no adequate word to describe even now. Figures were emerging from the darkness between the trees, dozens of them, moving with a silence that felt deeply, fundamentally wrong, as though the ordinary sounds a body makes when it walks, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, had simply been stolen from them somewhere deep in that forest. They wore the tattered remains of armor I recognized instantly, the armor of Ikemba's warband, the men who had ridden into Oke Ohia 10 years before and never returned. But their eyes, even from a distance in the dying light, held none of the life those men should have carried after a decade among the living. They held only a flat, hollow darkness, the way still water looks black at midnight even when you know somewhere beneath the surface there must still be depth.
And walking at the front of them, wearing my own face, my own crown, though I had never once left this palace to lose it in that forest, was a man the entire gathered crowd of Obodoma stared at in stunned, terrified silence. Because every person present, every single one of them, believed they were looking at their own king, somehow returned from 10 years of death. I want to pause here for a moment because I know exactly what you might be thinking right now, and I promise you, the truth is stranger and darker than you expect. Before I tell you what happened next, what my brother had truly become in that forest, and what it meant for everyone I loved, subscribe if you have not already, because this is only the middle of the story, and the deepest twist is still waiting in the trees ahead of us. The crowd parted before him the way water parts before a canoe, no one daring to speak, no one daring even to breathe too loudly, until he stopped perhaps 10 paces from where I stood, and for the first time in 10 years, I found myself looking directly into my own brother's eyes, and understanding with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that whatever stood before me was no longer entirely my brother at all. Ikemba, Amarachi whispered, and the word cracked in the middle, half hope, half horror, because even she, who had known my deception intimately for a decade, could not immediately tell which of us was truly her husband and which was the lie standing beside him. The figure smiled, and it was Ikemba's smile, quick and bright, exactly as I remembered it, and somehow that familiarity was more frightening than anything unfamiliar could have been. 10 years, he said, and his voice carried an echo beneath it, faint but unmistakable, as though two voices spoke in near-perfect unison, one warm and known, one distant and cold. 10 years, and my own brother sits my throne, sleeps in my bed, wears my crown before my own people, and not one of you thought to come looking for me. We searched,
Nuafo said, stepping forward despite his obvious terror, his old voice trembling but steady. For months, we searched every path into that forest. We found nothing, no trace, no sign that any man could have survived what our warriors described. You did not search hard enough, the figure said, and though his tone remained eerily pleasant, something beneath it in that strange doubled echo carried a threat sharp enough to make the entire crowd flinch as one body. But it does not matter now. I have come home, and I find I am not entirely pleased with what I have returned to. I stepped forward then, because someone had to, because I would not let my brother, or whatever remained of him, address our people, address Amarachi, address the truth of what I had done for 10 years without facing me directly first. Ikemba, I said, and my voice shook despite every effort to steady it. If you are truly my brother, then you know I never wanted this. You know Nuafo and Chioma came to me only because the kingdom faced ruin without a king to steady it. Everything I did to protect what you built, to protect these people until you could return to reclaim it. Something flickered across his face then, something that looked for just a moment painfully human, grief and recognition, and a longing so raw that it made my chest ache to witness it. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by that same flat darkness I had seen in his followers' eyes. I know what you tell yourself, he said quietly. I have watched, Emeka. Did you know that? I have watched this entire kingdom for 10 years from the deep places in that forest where the trees remember everything they witness. I watched you learn to laugh like me. I watched you learn to stand like me. And I watched you take my wife into your bed, brother, and tell yourself it was grief. Tell yourself it was necessary. Tell yourself any comfortable lie that let you sleep at night in a place that was never yours to claim. The crowd's gasp was audible, a single sharp intake of breath from hundreds of throats at once, and I felt every eye in that gathering turn towards me and Amarachi with a horror that no explanation, however true, could immediately soften. I searched the faces closest to me in that terrible moment, faces I had governed for a decade, faces that had bowed to me at festivals and brought me their disputes and trusted my judgment in matters both small and enormous, and I watched every one of them shift in the space of a single accusation from trust into something far more complicated. Betrayal tangled tightly with confusion, confusion tangled tightly with fear of the impossible figure still standing before us with his hollow-eyed army at his back. An old woman near the front of the crowd, one whose grandson had ridden into that forest a decade before and never returned, began weeping openly, though whether from grief renewed or grief finally validated, I could not tell in that chaotic moment. A younger warrior, barely more than a boy when Ikemba first vanished, reached instinctively for the hilt of his blade before catching himself, uncertain which king, if either of us, still deserved his loyalty. You do not understand what happened in that forest, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I understood how thin they sounded against the weight of his accusation. Tell us, tell your people, what truly happened to you if you want honesty laid bare between us tonight? For a long moment he said nothing, only studied me with those flat, unreadable eyes, and behind him his silent army of hollow-eyed warriors stood motionless, waiting as though the entire forest itself held its breath alongside them. Very well, he said finally, and something in his voice shifted, grew heavier, older, carrying for the first time a genuine weariness beneath its strange doubled echo. You want the truth, brother. Here is your truth. When the Ochendo raiders lured my war band into Oke Ohia, I discovered too late that we had not stumbled into an ordinary ambush. We had walked into the domain of Allah Oji, the old spirit of that forest, a being our ancestors made peace with generations ago by agreeing never to settle its deepest paths, an agreement your precious kingdom had long since forgotten existed. Chioa, the priestess, made a sound beside me, something between recognition and dread, and I understood, watching her face, that whatever he had just spoken was not unfamiliar to her, however carefully our people had buried it from common memory. "I know that name," she confirmed quietly, when Ikemba paused, her own voice heavy with a dread that seemed to have been waiting a long time to finally surface. "None of us could have known," Nuafo said, gently, though his own voice carried the same weight of unspoken guilt that seemed to have settled over every person old enough to remember the decisions that had led us to this moment. Alaoji offered me a bargain, the same bargain it has offered every desperate, drowning man who has ever wandered too deep into its shadow. My warriors were dying around me, cut down by shadow things I had no weapons to fight, and I was afraid, truly afraid for the first time in my life. Alaoji promised me power enough to save what remained of my men, power enough to drive the Ochendo
Raiders from its forest forever, in exchange for a single price, my humanity, offered slowly, season by season, until I belonged fully to the forest rather than to the kingdom I had sworn to protect. "You agreed?" I said quietly, horror settling cold and heavy in my chest. "I agreed," he said simply, "because in that moment, brother, saving my men mattered more to me than saving myself. I did not fully understand what the price would truly cost until it was already being paid, piece by piece, year by year, my memories of sunlight and market days and my wife's laughter fading a little further every season, replaced by something older, something patient, something that has been waiting a very long time to walk out of these trees and remind this kingdom exactly whose land it has always truly stood upon." He paused then, and something in his shoulders sagged, as though even the act of remembering cost him something he could not easily spare. "You cannot imagine what those first months were like, brother. I could still remember your face, Amanachi's laugh, the sound of the market at dawn, but each of those memories seemed to sit farther away with every passing season, like a shore receding behind a canoe, drifting steadily out to open water. I thought it, at first, with everything I had left. I tried to lead my remaining men back toward the forest edge more times than I can count, only to find the paths had rearranged themselves behind us, the trees themselves conspiring to keep us wandering deeper rather than closer to home. Eventually, I stopped trying to leave, not because I had given up, but because I began to understand that leaving too soon, before the bargain's price was fully paid, would only unleash Allah Oji's fury on the very kingdom I had sacrificed everything to protect. "You watched all of it happen," Amarachi said, quietly, her voice trembling with a grief that had clearly been waiting 10 years to find its target. "You watched me grieve you. You watched him become you. Why did none of you send word, some sign, anything to tell us the truth?" "Because the forest does not permit its captives to speak plainly of their captivity," Ikemba said, turning to look at her directly for the first time since his return, and something in his expression, beneath the strange doubled echo of his voice, softened into a grief so raw it silenced even the restless murmuring crowd. "I tried more than once in the early years to send some fragment of warning through the few hunters brave or foolish enough to skirt the forest edges. Each attempt cost me dearly, some piece of memory or feeling stripped away before I could complete it. By the 3rd year, I had learned to accept a terrible patience instead, watching from the forest depths as my brother learned to wear my life the way another man might wear a borrowed cloak, telling myself it was better than the alternative, better than leaving this kingdom to face invasion and chaos while its king rotted, forgotten in a stretch of cursed woodland no rescue party could safely reach. "Why now?" Nuafo asked, his voice barely steady.
Why return after 10 years, tonight of all nights? Because tonight the bargain reaches its final season, Ikemba said, and for the first time, real anguish broke through the flat coldness of his voice, human and raw and terrible to witness. Tonight, Ala Oji claims the last of what I owe it, unless the debt is paid another way. I did not come to reclaim my throne, brother. I came because the forest sends me to claim something far worse, and I have spent 10 years fighting to delay this exact moment, fighting with whatever fragment of myself the bargain has not yet consumed. What does it want? I asked, though some cold, sinking part of me had already begun to guess the answer before he spoke it aloud. It wants a life freely given, of royal blood, to seal the bargain permanently and release the rest of my men from their own slow transformation. It offered me a choice, brother, the only mercy it has shown me in 10 years of captivity. I could give my own life fully, becoming forever what I have only partly become until now. Or I could bring it yours instead, since you have spent 10 years wearing my blood, my name, my crown, my very wife, as though the distinction between us no longer mattered to this kingdom at all. The crowd erupted then, voices rising in horror and confusion, Amarachi crying out and stepping forward before Noafo caught her arm, and I stood, frozen at the center of it all, staring at my brother's borrowed face, understanding that everything I had built over 10 careful, guilty years had led directly to this single impossible choice standing between us in the dying light. Somewhere behind me, I heard a young mother pulling her children close, whispering to them that everything would be well, though her voice shook too visibly to convince even herself. I heard an old warrior, one of the few who had fought alongside our father in his own youth, mutter a low prayer to ancestors long past, asking for guidance in a moment none of our customs had ever prepared us to navigate. And beneath it all, I felt the particular crushing weight of every person in that gathering, waiting to see which brother would prove himself worthy of the crown they had for 10 confused and complicated years already placed their trust in, without fully understanding whose head truly wore it. I want you to sit with me in that terror for just a moment, because it is important you understand exactly how impossible that choice felt, before I tell you what I finally decided to do and what it truly cost every single one of us standing at that forest edge. If this story has kept you glued so far, if you feel the weight of that choice pressing against your own chest the way it pressed against mine, do not look away now. What happens next changes everything you think you understand about who the real villain of this story has been all along. You would ask me to choose between my own life and yours after everything this kingdom has survived because I was willing to become you for 10 years? Is that truly the brother I remember, Ikemba, or is that the forest speaking through whatever remains of him? Something in his expression cracked then, visibly, painfully, and for just a moment, the flat darkness in his eyes gave way to something achingly familiar, my brother's own grief, still buried somewhere beneath everything Ala Oji had made of him. I do not know anymore where I end and it begins, he admitted, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, though it still carried across the silent crowd. Chioma stepped forward then, drawing herself up with the particular authority of a priestess who has spent her entire life studying exactly the kind of old, patient darkness now standing before us. There is a third path, she said, her voice steady despite the visible fear beneath it. Old bargains like this one are rarely as absolute as the spirits who offer them claim. Ala Oji wants royal blood freely given, yes, but blood does not always mean death, and freely given does not always mean surrendered in silence. "Speak plainly, priestess," Ikemba said, though something in his posture had shifted, leaning towards her words the way a drowning man leans towards any offered rope. "The old stories say Alaoji's bargains were struck in an age before our people fully understood how to bind such spirits properly," Chioma said. "A blood debt freely given does not need to be a life ended. It can be a truth spoken, publicly, completely, without concealment, by the very blood the spirit claims as its due. Confession, freely offered before witnesses, has broken older bargains than this one, in stories my own teacher told me long before either of you were born." I understood in that moment exactly what she meant and exactly what it would cost me, and I did not hesitate. Not because I was brave, but because I finally understood that 10 years of hidden truth was precisely the wound that had allowed this entire nightmare to grow as large and as dangerous as it now stood before us. "Then let the truth be paid in full," I said, turning to face not my brother, not the priestess, but the entire gathered crowd of Obodoma, hundreds of faces staring back at me with a mixture of fear and confusion that I was about to transform, whether they thanked me for it or not, into something far more complicated. I felt my heart pounding so violently in that moment that I feared everyone close enough might hear it. But some deep, steady part of me, the same part that had once sat perfectly still for an entire afternoon of council disputes as a boy of 9, while my brother slept restlessly against the wall beside me, held firm beneath the fear, understanding with sudden and complete clarity that this was, perhaps, the single moment I had been quietly preparing for my entire life without ever knowing it. "My name is Chukwuemeka, twin brother to your true king, Ikemba, who did not die in that forest 10 years ago, but was captured by a bargain none of us fully understood until tonight. For 10 years, I have worn his face, spoken with his voice, ruled from his throne, not out of ambition, but because our council believed, rightly or wrongly, that Obodoma could not survive the truth of an empty throne during a season of war. I have loved his wife, Amarachi, in the years since, not as a deception forced upon her, but as something that grew slowly and honestly between two people who believed in good faith that her husband was lost to us forever. I offer you this truth now, freely, completely, with nothing further hidden, because I believe it is the only payment this forest's ancient claim was ever truly owed." The silence that followed was the deepest I have ever experienced in my life, a silence so complete I could hear the distant rustle of the forest itself, as though it too were listening, weighing the truth I had just offered against whatever it believed it was still owed. And then, slowly, the ground beneath Ikemba's feet began to glow with a faint, unnatural light, the same flat darkness that had filled his eyes for 10 years, suddenly rippling outward from him like water disturbed by a stone, and he cried out, not in triumph, but in something closer to release, as though a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten its true shape was finally being lifted from his shoulders. "The debt is paid," Chioma said, her voice hushed with something like awe. "Not with a life ended, but with a truth no longer buried. That is what it was always owed, Brother King. Not blood spilt, but blood honest." I watched my brother collapse to his knees before the entire kingdom, watched the hollow darkness slowly recede from his eyes, replaced agonizingly slowly by something achingly human, exhaustion and grief, and a decade of stolen memory struggling to resurface all at once. Behind him, his war band of lost warriors began to change as well, the flat emptiness in their own eyes softening, though I would learn in the difficult weeks that followed that not every man among them fully returned to himself. Some had been claimed too deeply, too long, and Alaoji, even in defeat, did not release every piece of what it had taken. The days that followed were among the hardest of my life, harder even than the 10 years of careful deception that preceded them. Ikemba needed time, real time, to relearn a kingdom that had continued moving forward without him, to reconcile the brother who had ruled in his name with genuine care against the violation of everything he had lost while trapped in that forest's slow, patient hunger. There were nights he could not look at me at all, nights his grief curdled into anger I understood completely and could not fully absolve myself of, regardless of how necessary Nwafon's original plan had once seemed. I remember one particular night, perhaps 2 weeks after his return, when he summoned me alone to the small private courtyard where our father used to take his evening meals, away from council chambers and watching eyes. He did not speak for a long while, simply stared out at the darkening sky. And when he finally turned to face me, his eyes, fully his own again, carried a depth of exhaustion I had never once seen on his face before that forest changed him. "I keep trying to hate you properly," he admitted, his voice rough. "It would be simpler, I think, if I could hate you the way a wronged man is supposed to hate the brother who took his crown and his wife. But every time I reach for that anger, I remember what Nwafon told me, what Amarachi told me, what half this kingdom has told me in the week since my return about the king they lived under for 10 years. Patient, fair, willing to walk a disputed stream at dawn rather than simply ruling from a comfortable throne. That was not a stranger wearing my face, Emeka. That was you, being exactly who you have always been. And somehow this makes this harder to carry, not easier." "I never wanted your throne," I said quietly. "I want you to know that, truly, beyond any doubt. I wanted my brother back. Every single day for 10 years, I wanted my brother back more than I wanted anything else in this world. And I built the best imitation of you I could manage, simply to buy this kingdom enough time to survive until that became possible again." He studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression, though still heavy with grief, softened just slightly. "I believe you," he said finally. "That does not mean the wound closes quickly. But I believe you, Emeka. I have watched you my entire life. I know the difference between ambition and duty, even when they wear the same face." Then there was Amarachi, caught between two brothers who shared a face but had, over 10 separate years, become two genuinely different men, each with a legitimate claim to a love she had never intended to divide so completely. I will not pretend that particular wound healed quickly, or simply, or in any way that made for a comfortable telling. She spent long months in quiet conversation with Ikemba, rebuilding whatever pieces of their marriage the forest had not entirely severed, and equally long months avoiding my presence entirely, unable to reconcile the love she had genuinely grown to feel for me against the guilt of having felt it at all. I finally spoke to her properly, only once during those difficult months, near the edge of the palace gardens where she often walked alone at dusk. She did not turn when she heard my footsteps approach, though I knew by the particular stillness in her shoulders that she was aware of exactly who had joined her. "I have spent 10 years learning to love you separately from him," she said quietly, before I could find any words of my own. "Not instead of him, Emeka. I need you to understand that distinction, because I have turned it over in my mind more times than I can count. I did not stop loving my husband when I began, slowly, against every instinct telling me it was wrong, to love you as well. I simply believed for 10 years that I would never have to choose between two separate loves, because I believed only one of you would ever truly exist for me to choose between." "And now?" I asked, though I already feared the answer.
Now I have to become the kind of woman capable of loving my husband fully again. The man who suffered 10 years I can barely imagine, without dishonoring what genuinely grew between us during the years I believed him lost forever," she said, finally turning to face me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I do not know how to do that yet. I only know that I owe him the honest attempt, the same way you owe this kingdom the honest truth you finally give it. Some debts, Emeka, can only be paid by choosing one path fully, even when your heart still aches for the other." I did not argue with her. What right did I have to argue against a wisdom I had only just learned myself, standing at that forest's edge, offering a truth I had buried for a decade, because I finally understood no amount of careful hiding could protect the people I loved from a debt eventually determined to be paid? I bowed my head to her, the way I had once bowed to her as my brother's wife, rather than the woman I had, for a season, dared to love as something more. And I walked away from that garden, understanding that some griefs simply had to be carried alone, regardless of how deeply another heart might wish to share their weight. The council, understandably, faced its own reckoning. Noafon, old and frail as he had become, offered his resignation the very week Ikemba's memory fully returned, believing himself responsible for a deception that had ultimately nearly cost the kingdom its true king entirely. Ikemba refused it. I remember him telling the old advisor, in a quiet conversation I was permitted to witness only because Ikemba insisted I be present, that a decision made honestly, in desperate circumstance to protect a kingdom from war, was not the same crime as a decision made in secret for personal gain, and that he intended to hold Noafo to that distinction for however many years the old man had left to serve. As for the throne itself, Ikemba did reclaim it, publicly, formally, in a ceremony that drew every remaining family of every warrior lost to that forest a decade before, a ceremony that finally allowed our people to grieve honestly, rather than in the confused, half-informed sorrow they had carried for 10 years without understanding its full shape. The ceremony itself lasted the better part of a full day, beginning at dawn with Chioma leading a procession to the forest's edge, where she performed a cleansing rite meant to formally close the old bargain and ensure Alaoji's influence could never again reach so deeply into the affairs of the living. I stood near the back of that procession, watching my brother kneel at the very tree line where he had once ridden to war so full of certainty, and I saw, even from that distance, the way his shoulders trembled as the priestess spoke the closing words, releasing him fully at last from a debt that had shaped every single day of the past decade. The remaining warriors who had returned with him, those whose humanity had not been claimed too deeply by the forest's slow hunger, wept openly during that rite, several of them collapsing to their knees in a grief that had waited 10 years for permission to finally surface. Not every man among them recovered fully. 3 of the returned warriors never regained the fullness of their former selves, remaining forever after somewhat distant, somewhat hollow around the eyes, though gentle and harmless, cared for by their families with a patient tenderness that our people, I noticed, extended to them without judgment, understanding instinctively that they had paid a price on behalf of the entire kingdom that no ceremony could ever fully repay. By midday, the procession returned to the palace, where Ikemba was formally presented before the full council and the gathered families of Obodoma, and Noafo, his old hands trembling with an emotion he did not bother to hide, placed our father's beaded crown once more upon the head of the true king, a crown I had worn every single day for 10 years, and now, in that single ceremonial moment, finally surrendered with a relief so profound it nearly buckled my knees. But he did not rule as he once had, quick and bright and untouched by doubt. Something in him remained forever changed by those years trapped in Alaoji's patient hunger, a heaviness beneath his laughter that had not existed before, a habit of watching the tree line at dusk with an expression none of us could fully read. He asked me some month later to remain at the palace not as a hidden deception, but as an openly acknowledged brother and counselor, the role I believe I had always been better suited to carry in the first place, though it took 10 years and a forest spirit's ancient bargain to finally let both of us occupy the roles we were truly meant for. I accepted, though the years that followed carried their own quiet grief, watching Amarachi slowly rebuild her life fully within her marriage again, understanding that whatever had grown between us during those 10 uncertain years belonged ultimately to a season that circumstance alone had created, and that true healing for all of us required letting that season end. I think often of the choice I made that night at the forest's edge, offering truth instead of silence, understanding now that Chioma always seemed to know that some debts cannot be paid with more hiding, no matter how carefully intentioned the hiding once was. I think of my brother, forever changed by what that forest asked of him, and of the strange mercy that his own captivity in the end was broken not by violence or sacrifice, but by the simple, terrifying act of speaking a truth I had buried for a decade in front of everyone I had ever deceived. I think, too, of the smaller reckonings that followed in the months after the ceremony, the quieter ones that never made it into the songs the market storytellers began composing almost immediately about the twin who wore a king's crown and the king who returned from the dead. There was the awkward, careful process of reintroducing myself to my own name after 10 years of answering only to my brothers. The strange experience of hearing children in the market call me Chukwuemeka for the first time in their short lives, unaware that I had ever been called anything else. There was the slow rebuilding of my relationship with Nwaso, who carried a guilt of his own for having proposed the deception in the first place, a guilt I worked hard in the months that followed to help him set down, reminding him often that whatever mistakes our small council had made, we made them trying to protect a kingdom none of us wished to see fall to war and chaos. There was also, unexpectedly, a new closeness that grew between Ikemba and I in the years following his return, once the sharpest edges of his grief and anger had softened into something more like understanding. He began asking me, quietly at first, and then with growing regularity, to sit beside him during council sessions, not as a hidden twin pretending to be him, but openly as his brother and trusted counselor, exactly the role our father had once described so long ago in that half-forgotten conversation about fire and water. I watched him rule with a wisdom tempered by suffering he had never possessed before the forest changed him, quicker to listen now, slower to anger, though the quick, bright laugh of his youth never fully returned in the same easy way it once had. Some nights, sitting together in that same small courtyard where he had once confessed he could not properly hate me, we spoke instead of our father, of the boyhood we had shared before either of us understood what burdens fate had prepared for us. And in those quiet conversations, I found something I had not expected to find again so easily: the simple, uncomplicated comfort of having my brother back, not as a name I wore or a face I imitated, but as the person he had always been beneath all of it, forever changed but still, unmistakably, still Ikemba. I watched, sitting beside him now, not as a secret twin, but as an openly acknowledged brother, the particular way his gaze still lingered a moment too long on the tree line whenever council business carried us near the palace's outer walls. A small, private wound that I understood better than anyone alive, and that I never once pressed him to explain. Obodoma stands still today, between its two rivers, its borders quiet, its harvests full, ruled once more by the king our people always believed sat that throne, though now, at last, by the true one, rather than his careful shadow. I do not know if Ikemba will ever trust the tree line at the forest's edge again, and I do not blame him for that particular wound. Some debts, once paid, still leave scars behind that no ceremony can ever fully smooth away. Amarachi, too, found her own careful peace in the years that followed, choosing, as she told me she must, to pour herself fully back into the marriage she had once believed permanently lost. And I watched that choice slowly heal something in both her and my brother that 10 years of separation and one impossible night at the forest's edge had nearly broken beyond repair. I will not claim the three of us ever became entirely comfortable in one another's company again, not in the easy, uncomplicated way we might have been had none of this ever happened. But comfort, I have come to understand, is not always the measure of whether love or loyalty has truly endured. Sometimes endurance looks like three people who once shared an impossible burden, choosing every single day afterward to remain kind to one another despite everything that burden cost them. But I know this much for certain, watching my brother rule again with the particular hard-won wisdom that only 10 years of imaginable loss could have taught him. A kingdom built on hidden truth, however well-intentioned, is always a kingdom standing on ground that can shift beneath it without warning. It took a forest spirit and a decade of stolen memory to teach both of us that lesson, but I do not intend to forget it again, not for as long as I draw breath in this land between the two rivers. If this story has kept you here until its final word, if you have felt the weight of that forest bargain settle into your own chest the way it settled into mine, then you already understand why stories like this one matter, why the old tales our grandmothers whispered by firelight still carry truths worth carrying forward. Subscribe now so that